19 of the finest acoustic engineers in the world, had spent 5 days inside a concert hall that refused to sing, and not one of them could tell Cassius Rinaldi why. The vessel had taken him 7 years and a number he'd never say out loud, built on the bones of an old warehouse in Fox Point, Providence, with hundreds of servo-driven diffusion panels, a floor so heavy it rode on pneumatic dampers, and alpine spruce 2 centuries old lining walls that were themselves 3 layers thick. He hadn't built it for money. He'd built it for his sister Rosalind, who'd been hearing the world through one ear since she was 6, and who had never once in her life heard a piece of music whole. On opening night, 400 people filled every seat. Rosalind sat in the front row. The chamber orchestra lifted their bows, played the first note, and 11 seconds later the sound in that room simply died, collapsing flat and lifeless, like music heard through a pillow. Rosalind turned to her brother and didn't say anything at all. She just touched her left ear, the way she'd been doing since she was 6 years old, every single time the world went half quiet on her again. Cassius Rinaldi ran 3 shipping companies, a stretch of the Providence waterfront, and a name that people in 3 New England cities knew but didn't say out loud. He'd never raised his voice in his adult life. He didn't need to. And on the 5th day, with the room still silent, and most of those credentialed experts packing up their instruments, he put $3.5 million on the table, gave it 48 hours, and told them to send him anyone who thought they could hear what he couldn't. Then, at 6:40 on the 6th morning, he found a woman sitting on the floor of his concert hall. Not standing, sitting cross-legged right in the middle of the 9th row, eyes closed. She was 28, wearing a man's overcoat 2 sizes too big, her dark hair tied back with a piece of stripped electrical wire. She hadn't touched anything. She'd walked 8 kilometers through the dark to get there, because the city had towed her car 4 days earlier, and that car was where she lived. She had $61 to her name. She had no license, no tools, no business card, and nothing in her hands. 4 days ago she'd stood at that same door, and a man with 34 years in the field had looked straight at her and said he didn't have time for crazy people. And she'd said, "Yes, sir," and walked away, because she'd learned a long time ago that arguing costs energy, and energy was something she had to save for walking. Cassius asked her who she was. She told him she slept in a Buick in the parking lot behind St. Brendan's Church. Then she told him she'd been listening since she was 7 years old. He asked if she could fix it. She said she thought she could hear what was wrong, and that fixing it was the second part. He asked what the first part was. She said, understanding why 19 people couldn't hear it. And Cassius Rinaldi, a man who could spot arrogance from across a crowded room and had built a life on keeping it at arm's length, recognized instantly that there wasn't a trace of it in her. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. He said, 5 minutes. If a story like this is why you're here, do us a favor and hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who's been underestimated one too many times, and subscribe, because we've got more of these coming. Now let's go back to that hall at 6:40 in the morning and find out exactly what she heard. She rose from the 9th row without saying another word, and Cassius Rinaldi realized that he had been standing there for who knew how long, waiting for an explanation she had never intended to give. Mara Volkov stepped into the center aisle. She moved slowly, so slowly that Pete Langstrom, who had just arrived and was standing at the back of the room, with the faint chill of morning still clinging to the shoulders of his coat, had to look closely before he could tell she was moving at all. She stopped for the first time about 1/3 of the way down the aisle, standing still, her head tilted slightly, her arms hanging at her sides. She didn't close her eyes. She simply stared into the empty space in front of the stage, as though something were suspended there that only she could see. Then she continued. She stopped a second time. The third time, she stopped in the middle of the room, at the exact point where, 7 years earlier, an architect from Vienna had marked the blueprint in red ink and called it the heart of the room. And no one in that auditorium knew she had stopped precisely there. No one except Pete, who had held those plans in his hands hundreds of times, and now felt something very small and very cold travel down his spine. The 4th time, she stopped at the very edge of the stage. Then she did the one thing no one in the room had expected. She knelt. Then she lay face down on the floor. She pressed her left cheek, then her ear, against the wooden surface, her arms stretched out on either side like someone drifting across the surface of water, and she remained perfectly still, One of Cassius's two men stepped half a pace forward. Cassius raised one hand, not even as high as his waist, and the man stopped. And so Cassius Rinaldi, the man who had spent 7 years and a sum of money he never spoke aloud to build this room, stood watching a strange woman in an oversized man's coat lying face down on the floor of his auditorium, and he did nothing to stop her. Nearly a minute passed. No one spoke. Somewhere outside on Fox Point Road, a truck went by, distant and muffled, swallowed almost entirely by 3 layers of walls, leaving behind something that sounded more like breathing than an engine. Then Mara stood. She didn't brush off her coat. She walked to the center of the room and clapped once. Only once. The sound rose, struck the ceiling, and fell dead where it landed, flat and brief, with nothing behind it at all. And Ingrid Salveson, standing in the right aisle with the tablet she hadn't opened in 5 days, heard that sound and felt herself shiver, because she had heard it 300 times in 5 days, and not once had it made her shiver. Mara counted. She counted silently with her mouth, her lips moving slightly. Then she walked to the northeast corner. She stood close to the place where the 2 walls met, so close that her nose nearly touched the 2-century-old spruce, and she clapped again, counted again. Then she walked along the eastern wall, never touching it, only moving parallel to it, until she stopped at a place that looked exactly like every other place to every pair of eyes in the room. It was the expansion joint. She stood there longer than she had stood anywhere else. Pete Langstrom looked at the place where she was standing and felt that cold thing travel down his spine for the 2nd time. Then she turned back. She walked up to the 9th row, slipped into the exact place where she had been sitting at 6:40, and lowered herself onto the floor, crossing her legs and closing her eyes. And for the final 20 seconds, she did nothing at all. She didn't tilt her head, she didn't clap, she didn't count. She simply sat there, both hands resting open on her knees, and breathed. When she opened her eyes, 7 people were standing there watching her. Cassius, Pete, Ingrid, Cassius's 2 men, a young technician whose name no one remembered, and at the back of the room, leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded across his chest and an expression no one could read, Hollis Treadway, who had booked a ticket back to Detroit 3 times and changed it 3 times, because he didn't walk away from an unfinished problem, even when that problem had defeated him. No one knew when Pete had arrived. Cassius walked down the aisle. He didn't hurry. He had never hurried in his adult life. He stopped at the end of the 9th row and looked down at the woman sitting on the floor of his auditorium, and he asked the only question left to ask. "What did you hear?" Mara Volkov looked up, and she said, "I heard a room covering its own ears." The night before, at 9 o'clock, Mara Volkov walked back from the wayside soup kitchen, with her hands still slightly swollen from the hot water, and the smell of industrial soap clinging to her hair, and she turned into the parking lot behind St. Brendan's Church the way she had turned into it every night for 4 years, and the space was empty. She stopped at the edge of the asphalt. She stared at that empty space for a long while, the way people stare at a familiar word that has been misspelled, with the feeling that something is wrong arriving before understanding does. The Buick had stood in that exact spot. Since the autumn of the year she lost everything. It had remained there through 4 Rhode Island winters. It had been there when snow buried the windshield so completely that she had to scrape it away with a plastic spoon from the soup kitchen. It had stood there through nights when the temperature fell so low that she had to wear all 3 layers of clothing and still woke shivering from the cold, and through July nights when she had to roll down all 4 windows and lie there listening to the cicadas in the maple trees beside the church. No one had ever touched it. 4 years, without a single ticket, a single knock on the door, or a single question. She had grown so accustomed to that mercy that she no longer thought of it as good fortune. She thought of it as the ground beneath her feet, and now the ground was gone. She walked to the payphone on the corner, the only working telephone she knew of within walking distance, and called the number printed on the sign attached to the lamppost. A tired man's voice on the other end told her how much it would cost to get the car back. He read the amount the way someone reads something he has already read 40 times that day. Then he added that the storage fee would be charged by the day, beginning the next morning. Mara said thank you. She said thank you because she always said thank you, even to people who had just told her a number she didn't have in her pocket, didn't have in her account, and didn't have anywhere else in the world. She lowered the receiver. Then she walked back to the parking lot and stood in that empty space for 40 minutes. She didn't cry, she didn't sit down. She stood there with both hands in the pockets of her coat and did what she had done for the past 4 years whenever something was taken from her. She stood still and waited for the part of her that wanted to scream to cool down, because screaming cost energy, and energy was something she had to save. During those 40 minutes, she thought about many things, and she didn't say any of them aloud. But in the final minute, when she turned to leave, one sentence slipped from her mouth, very softly, addressed to no one at all, not to God, not to the tired man on the other end of the line, not to the city that had decided tonight was the night it would remember she existed. She said, "The dress is still in there." Then she went into the church hallway. The door wasn't locked. It had never been locked. She lay down on the long wooden bench against the wall, the bench she had seen through the glass on thousands of nights without ever once lying upon it, and she rested her head on her folded arm and looked up at the hallway light, the pale yellow round bulb fixed to the ceiling that had gone dark for a single night in 4 years, and she slept for about 3 hours. At 5 o'clock in the morning, she woke. She smoothed her coat, tied back her hair, and walked toward the door. Father Wendell Price was standing there. He stood as though he had been there for some time, or as though he simply happened to be there, and there was no way to know which was true. In his hand was a paper cup of coffee, still hot, already prepared with exactly the amount of milk she usually added. He held it out to her. He didn't ask where she had slept the night before. He didn't ask about the car. He didn't ask where she intended to go at 5 o'clock in the morning, now that she no longer had a car to take her anywhere. He simply gave her the coffee, nodded once, very slightly, then turned back inside and closed the door behind him. Mara held the cup in both hands for a while because her hands were cold, then stepped out into the darkness. She walked 8 kilometers, not because she was curious, not because of the $3.5 million. She walked because she had run out of places to stand, and walking was easier than sitting still and thinking about the dress lying inside a car in an impound lot she couldn't afford to enter. The sentence remained suspended in the air for a while, and no one knew what to do with it, and then Pete Langstrom came down the aisle and stopped her before she could rise. He wasn't rude. He didn't have enough energy left to be rude. He was 61 years old, and he had slept perhaps 10 hours in total over the past 5 days, and his face carried the look of a man who had passed beyond exhaustion and arrived somewhere calmer, somewhere emptier. He told her his name. He told her he was the chief engineer. He said he was sorry to interrupt, but before she said anything more, he needed her to know what they had already done, because he didn't want her wasting her time retracing the same path 19 other people had already walked. And then he told her. He told it the way people recount a nightmare from which they woke halfway through, and still aren't entirely certain they're awake. On the first day, they measured everything. Signal guns at 9 positions, microphones at 12 points, a full frequency sweep. The reverberation time matched the figure on the plans, so precisely that Ingrid Salveson had asked him whether he was certain he was showing her data from opening night rather than the calibration data from the previous month. On the second day, they dismantled and inspected the diffusion system. 1 panel at a time, every servo responded with intolerance. Not one was out of alignment, not one was jammed. The firmware was the correct version, and the checksums matched. On the second day, they also checked the floor, checked the walls, checked the vacuum chambers, checked the ventilation system, and even checked the one thing no one thought needed checking, the lighting system, in case some transformer was vibrating at a frequency no one had noticed. There was nothing. On the third day, and this was where Pete paused for a beat, on the third day they brought in 400 people. He said this very calmly. He said he knew it was the first thing anyone would ask about. Audience absorption, of course. That was a second-year lesson. They weren't idiots. So they had called people in. 400 people, occupying every seat, exactly the same number of seats filled on opening night. They repeated the entire measurement sequence, and the room performed perfectly. The reverberation time matched the design figure. No deviation, no collapse, nothing at all. Pete said he had stood at the back of the room that day, staring at the screen, and felt something he had never felt in 22 years. It wasn't disappointment. It was something closer to disorientation, the feeling of stepping down onto a stair that isn't there. Because if the room performed correctly with 400 people sitting inside it, then opening night had never happened. But it had happened. 400 people had heard it happen. There was video. On the 4th and 5th days, they repeated everything from the beginning, twice, using different equipment, with different people operating that equipment, because by then the only theory left was that someone on the team had made a mistake somewhere. No one had. Pete looked down at his hands, and then he said the sentence he had been thinking for 5 days, but hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. "It isn't broken, Ms. Volkov. That's the part that keeps me from sleeping. For 22 years, I've been paid to find what's broken. People call me when something breaks. I come, I find it, I replace it, and I go home. That's my entire profession. Nothing here is broken. I've searched for 5 days, and I haven't found a single broken thing, and I'm beginning to think that even if I search for another 5 days, I still won't find one. Because it isn't there." He raised his eyes to her. "This room is right when we measure it. It's only wrong when people use it. And I don't have a name for that." Mara Volkov sat motionless on the floor beside the 9th row and listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt him once. She didn't nod, didn't take notes, didn't ask him to repeat a single detail of anything he had just told her. When he finished, she let the silence remain there for one more beat. Then she asked exactly one question, and it was the only question she asked him that entire morning. "When they were sitting in here, what did you tell them to do?" Pete Langstrom said, "Sit still." He said nothing more. But he no longer looked at her. Mara rose from the floor and walked down the aisle, and when she turned to face the 7 people standing there, the first thing she said wasn't about any single component. "It isn't one problem, it's 4 things, and all 4 of them are working correctly." Ingrid Salveson opened her mouth as though she meant to say something, then stopped. Mara continued, no faster and no slower, her voice even, like someone reading a grocery list aloud. "Your floor is floating. I don't know what it's floating on, because I haven't seen the plans. I only know that it's floating, because it answers half a beat late. When I clapped in the middle of the room, the floor answered afterward. Not much afterward, only a little, and that little delay belongs to something suspended, not something standing on the ground." "And it was balanced for an empty room?" Pete asked. And he wasn't asking to challenge her, he was asking because he genuinely needed to know. "How do you know it's floating?" Mara said, "I lay down on it." No one laughed. Pete opened the file case he had been carrying for 5 days, turned to the page with the structural diagram of the floor, and read aloud the number of pneumatic dampers and the calibration load assigned to them. And he read it the way someone reads a sentence in a book, and suddenly realizes he has never understood it before. Mara gave a very slight nod, as though the number merely confirmed something she had already decided 15 minutes earlier, and continued, "Second, your diffusion system doesn't only listen to the room, it listens to itself. When I clapped in the northeast corner and counted, the tail of the sound didn't fade evenly. There was a ripple in the middle, very small, as though someone were making an adjustment while the sound was still dying away. That isn't a fault. That's the system doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's correcting itself according to what it measures. The problem is that part of what it measures is being created by the system itself." Pete turned the page. He read out the servo sampling rate and the processing delay. Ingrid Salveson took one small step forward, and no one noticed, not even her. "Third," Mara said, and she walked toward the eastern wall without touching it, stopping about 1 pace away. "Here, there's a joint here. I don't know what you call it on the plans, but when I stood here, the wall answered differently. Not by much. It answered as though something behind it were breathing. And it will breathe more deeply as the room warms, because that's what metal and wood do when they become warm. They expand, and this joint was designed to let them do exactly that. It isn't broken. It's doing precisely what someone paid it to do." Pete didn't need to turn the page this time. He knew that page by heart. He recited the number of thermal expansion joints in the 3-layer wall and the range of movement they were designed to permit, and his voice had changed. It was lower now, slower, and when he finished reading, he said nothing. "Fourth," Mara said. "Your wood is real wood. Real wood drinks. It drinks everything in the air, and in a room filled with people, there is a great deal in the air for it to drink. After about 20 minutes, the surface of the wood is no longer the same surface you calibrated. It's more humid. It absorbs sound differently. Only slightly. So slightly that if this were the only thing I told you, you would throw me out, and you would be right to do it. Pete turned to the final page of the file, the page containing the absorption coefficients for spruce at different levels of surface humidity, and he read the percentage aloud, and it was so small that it sounded like a joke. Mara said yes. Small. All 4 things are small. Each one by itself is within tolerance. Each one is working correctly. Not one of these 4 things is broken, and if you inspect them one by one, you'll find exactly what you've found over the past 5 days, which is nothing at all. And that was when Ingrid Salvesen set down her tablet. She didn't set it down because she was surrendering. She set it down because she had just realized something she wouldn't say aloud for many hours, which was that the woman in the oversized man's coat had just described 4 systems inside a room, whose plans she had never been allowed to see, and through all 4 explanations, she hadn't spoken a single number. Mara allowed the sound of the tablet being set down to fade completely before she continued, and when she did, her voice remained unchanged, still the voice of someone reading aloud from a grocery list. But those 4 things don't live separately. They speak to one another. That floating floor, when the load upon it changes, doesn't break. It only shifts a little. It finds a new place to settle, and in that new position, it vibrates at a slightly different rhythm. Your diffusion system hears that new rhythm. It has to hear it. That's its job. But the floor's new rhythm is almost exactly the same as the rhythm the diffusion system uses to listen, and so it begins adjusting itself in response to something it is helping to create. And it adjusts, and that adjustment makes the floor shift a little more, and then it adjusts again. Meanwhile, the joint in the wall opens farther because the room is growing warmer. And when it opens farther, the chamber behind the wall responds differently within a very narrow frequency band. And that very narrow band falls precisely where the floor has just shifted. And while all of that is happening, the wood is drinking, and it drinks just enough for that laughably small number to join the rest, and push everything 1 grain farther out of place. 4 things, none of them broken. But together they create a 5th thing, and that 5th thing isn't in your plans, because no one ever drew it, because it isn't a component. It is what happens between the components. No one said anything. Mara walked a few steps toward the stage and stopped. And when that 5th thing appears, your diffusion system looks at it and doesn't recognize it. It has no name for it in its tables. It isn't a fault, it isn't a warning, and it isn't something the system was taught to handle. It is an undefined state. And do you know what a well-written system does when it encounters an undefined state? It doesn't guess. It doesn't take risks. It withdraws. Your 340 panels lock themselves at the neutral angle and remain there, and they do it for 11 seconds, and they do it perfectly. She turned to look at Cassius Rinaldi. Your room isn't broken, Mr. Rinaldi. Your room is doing exactly what the finest people in the profession spent 7 years teaching it to do. It has detected a condition it can't resolve safely, so it protects itself. The only problem is that the condition it has detected isn't dangerous. Nothing is about to break. No one is about to be hurt. It is hiding from something that doesn't exist. It is a ghost. You spent 7 years building a room sensitive enough to hear a ghost, and it heard one, and it did exactly what anything intelligent does when it hears something it doesn't understand. It became silent. Ingrid Salvesen looked down at her hands. Hollis Treadway had unfolded his arms and was standing upright in the doorway, and he had no idea when he had moved. Mara said, "And you didn't hear it because that 5th thing appears only 400 people in the room breathe in the same rhythm. People don't breathe in the same rhythm when they sit. They breathe in the same rhythm when they listen. That is what music does to people. It draws the breath of 400 people toward the same place, and that is when the load upon your floor begins rising and falling like a chest. You brought 400 people into this room. You did the right thing, but you told them to sit still." She paused. "You needed to tell them to listen, and the silence that followed wasn't the silence of disbelief. Not one person argued. Not one person asked her to repeat herself. It was the silence of people retracing 5 days inside their own minds, hour by hour, measurement by measurement, and seeing clearly, each of them in turn, the missing stair they had stepped toward, and realizing that they had missed it, not because they had been careless, not because they were ignorant, but because they had done everything their profession had taught them to do. No one had been wrong. That was the part that hurt. Pete Langstrom walked to the steel toolbox at the edge of the stage and sat down on its lid, both hands braced upon his knees, and he stared at the floor for a long time. Then he said, "To no one at all. We measured a room. You listened to a system." Ingrid Salveson was the one who broke the silence, and she broke it not with an objection, but with a question. And that question was the first thing she had asked in 5 days, because she truly wanted to know, rather than because she wanted to eliminate another possibility. She asked how far the floor shifted. She said that if Mara was right, then there had to be a number, there had to be a frequency shift constant, and if that number fell outside the range sampled by the diffusion system, then the entire story about the ghost would collapse. She said this very politely, in that unmistakably Nordic way, without a single grain of malice in it, only the stubborn need of someone who had spent her whole life checking things. And Mara, who was still standing in the middle of the aisle and still answering another question from the young technician about the joint in the wall, stopped in the middle of her sentence. She looked up at the ceiling for a moment. Her lips moved very slightly, exactly as they had when she counted the echo of her own clap. Less than a minute later, she gave a number. Then she turned back to the young technician's question and finished the sentence she had left incomplete, as though she had merely paused to remember the name of a street. Ingrid Salveson picked up the tablet. She opened it, and for 3 minutes no one in the auditorium spoke a word. There was only the sound of her fingers tapping, the sound of her moving back and forth between tables, and the breathing of 7 people standing there watching an 8th person perform a calculation. 3 minutes later, she looked up. She gave her number. It differed from Mara's by less than 2%. She said that aloud, slowly and clearly, as though she needed to hear herself say it before she could believe it. Then she said, "You calculated that in your head." Mara said, "It's a ratio." "It isn't very complicated," Ingrid said. "It is complicated," and her voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of an expert invited from Copenhagen, observing a homeless woman in an oversized man's coat. It was the voice of one engineer speaking to another. And the change happened so quickly that Ingrid herself never had time to decide whether it had happened or not. It simply happened, like a door you don't realize you have passed through, until you turn back and find it closed behind you. Ingrid continued, and this time she asked the question she had wanted to ask from the moment Mara said the word, "third," and walked toward the eastern wall. She asked whether she had understood correctly, whether Mara had deduced the structure of a 3-layer wall with a vacuum chamber simply by standing 1 pace away from it and clapping in 5 minutes. Mara said, "Not exactly." Ingrid waited, but Mara had already turned to Pete Langstrom and asked about the location of the damper nearest the stage, and Pete had begun to answer, and the moment passed and closed, and not one of the 8 people in the auditorium that morning gave those 2 words another second of thought. No one pressed her, no one remembered them. They sank beneath the surface along with the 100 others said that morning, and they remained there, silent, for weeks. Hollis Treadway was still standing at the back of the room. He had been there from the beginning, and he hadn't spoken a single word, and he wouldn't speak a single word until all of this was over. But he had lowered his arms, and he had stepped about 1/2 a meter beyond the doorway, and that was all he did. And in the 34 years of his career, it was almost the equivalent of a shout. And Cassius Rinaldi, standing at the end of the 9th row with both hands in his trouser pockets, wasn't looking at Mara. He didn't look at her once during the 3 minutes Ingrid spent calculating, and he didn't look at her when Ingrid gave her number. He watched Ingrid Salveson. He watched the face of the woman who had flown here from Copenhagen, who had failed, and who had booked her flight home, and he read it, crease by crease, the way he had read faces throughout his adult life, because that was the skill that had kept him alive. As for reading the woman in the oversized coat, he had finished doing that long ago. He had finished at 6:40, outside the door, when she told him she slept in a car. Cassius Rinaldi took out his phone and stepped into the hallway, and he spoke for about 4 minutes, his tone clipped, precise, and carrying the quiet weight of a man who expected to be obeyed. Over the next 2 hours, 399 people entered the vessel. They came from the harbor with their reflective vests still on their bodies. They came from 3 restaurants in Federal Hill, with aprons slung over their shoulders. They were truck drivers, welders, and 2 women who worked the morning shift at a bakery on Wickenden Street, whose owner had closed the shop at 10 o'clock so they could go. Not one of them knew what they had come to do. They only knew that someone had called, And when that person called, people came. They sat down, filling all 400 seats, and they looked around the room the entire city had read about in the newspapers, and they whispered among themselves, and that whisper rose, faded, then rose again like water in a basin someone had just set down. Meanwhile, the repair was finished. It was finished so quickly that it felt almost insulting. Pete Langstrom and 2 of his men recalibrated the entire damping system for dynamic load instead of static load, and it took them less than an hour and didn't require a single replacement part. Ingrid Salveson sat with the young technician and changed the servo sampling frequency, and it was one line, a single line in a configuration file, and when she saved it, she sat motionless for several seconds, then said something in Danish that no one translated. And 3 thermal expansion pads were fitted into the 3 joints along the eastern wall, pads that one of Cassius's men had gone to buy from a supply store on Allen Street. And all 3 together cost less than lunch for 2 people. And the man brought them back in a brown paper bag and placed the bag on the steel toolbox where Pete had sat that morning, and no one said anything about that bag, and everyone looked at it. The chamber orchestra returned near noon. They went onto the stage and tuned their instruments, and the sound of that tuning moved into 400 people, and 400 people gradually fell silent. Rosalind Rinaldi sat in the front row. She had been sitting there since people first began entering the room, and she hadn't risen once, and her brother stood in the aisle behind her, because he didn't sit. Mara Volkov stood at the door. She didn't go onto the stage. She didn't hold a microphone. She stood at the door with both hands in the pockets of the oversized man's coat, and when the entire room had become still, she spoke, and her voice wasn't loud, but 3 layers of walls, 2 centuries of spruce, and 340 diffusion panels carried it throughout the room, because that was precisely what they had been created to do. She said, "Don't sit still. Listen." Then she said nothing more. The conductor raised his hand. He held it there longer than necessary. Then he lowered it, and the first note left the strings and entered the air, and it remained. It remained inside the room. It rose and touched the ceiling, and instead of falling dead the way the clap had that morning, it opened, it bloomed, it settled over 400 people like something warm and weighted, and it stayed for exactly the length of time an architect from Vienna had written in red ink on a blueprint 7 years earlier, and then it released them, slowly, fully, without haste, the way sound releases itself in rooms that take a lifetime to build. In the front row, Rosalind Rinaldi didn't turn toward her brother. She closed her eyes and lifted her left hand to touch her left ear, the gesture she had made since she was 6 years old, the gesture her brother had seen thousands of times and had always found the same thing inside. But this time, it wasn't a gesture of loss. This time, it was something entirely different, and Cassius had no name for it, and she touched her ear before the note reached her, half a second before. No one noticed. 400 people began to applaud, then they rose to their feet, and the applause struck the walls and came back and folded into itself until it was no longer applause at all, but a vast, warm roar filling every empty space in the room. And Cassius Rinaldi, the man who had never once raised his voice in his entire adult life, stood in the rear aisle, with both hands in his trouser pockets and couldn't speak a single word. 400 people were still standing and still applauding, and someone in the middle rows had begun to whistle, and in the midst of all of it, Mara Volkov turned her head toward the round clock mounted on the wall above the service door. The clock no one in the auditorium had glanced at even once all morning. Then she spoke, and she spoke to Cassius, not to the room, in the voice of someone announcing the weather. "I have to go." He wasn't certain he had heard her correctly. He tilted his head perhaps half an inch. "Go where?" "The soup kitchen. I washed dishes on the afternoon shift." She pulled down her sleeve to cover her wrist. "If I don't show up, they'll have to call Teresa. She's been on her feet since 6 o'clock this morning." And Cassius Rinaldi stood there in the rear aisle of the room that had consumed 7 years of his life, and a sum he never spoke aloud, with 400 people striking their hands together in front of him because of something this woman had just done, and he listened to her say that she needed to go wash dishes so a 54-year-old woman could sit down. And for one very brief moment, he didn't know where he was. He walked with her to the door. No one stopped them, because his 2 men had already stepped aside before he had time to signal them. The eastern hallway was colder than the auditorium, and the applause followed them out there, compressed by 3 layers of walls into a steady, muffled roar that sounded more like the sea than human voices. Cassius opened the door. Noon light poured in, and the two of them stood there for a moment on the boundary between inside and outside. Then he asked the question he had wanted to ask since 6:40 that morning. He asked where she had learned to listen. Mara looked out across the lot behind the old warehouse, where several pallets were stacked together beside a puddle left by the rain 2 days earlier. My mother played the organ, she said, at a Ukrainian church in Fall River. It wasn't large. The organ was larger than the church. Someone brought it there from somewhere before I was born. She was silent for a while. She practiced on Saturday afternoons. No one was ever in the church on Saturday afternoons. She thought I sat in the last pew doing my homework. Cassius waited. I sat inside the pipe, Mara said, the lowest one. It had a maintenance door at the bottom, and when you're 7 years old, you can fit through it, and you sit inside, and when she presses that key, the whole pipe trembles around you, and you no longer hear the sound. You're inside it. You sit inside a pipe that is speaking, and you learn how a pipe knows what it is saying to a room. She never knew. I never told her. She turned back to look at him, and there was nothing on her face. No nostalgia, no sorrow, only precision. 21 years later, I'm still doing exactly that. I'm still sitting inside the pipe. Cassius looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "The $3.5 million is real. I assume it is," Mara said. "Otherwise, it would be fraud. You didn't ask about it." She gave a small shrug, so slight it was almost nothing. The problem was more interesting. A beat passed. I wanted to know whether I was still right, and Cassius Rinaldi, who had built an entire life upon hearing what people didn't say, heard that word. Still. Not whether she was right, whether she was still right. That word had a shadow behind it, and the shadow was long, and it said that once she had been right, and sometime afterward someone had told her she wasn't, and she had lived with that long enough for the word to slip from her mouth without her noticing. He didn't ask. He stood in the doorway and watched her cross the pallet yard, disappear around the far end of the warehouse, and he didn't say a word. Then he took out his phone, but he didn't call anyone. He simply held it in his hand, and he stood there for a long time at the Eastern Service door while behind him, through 3 layers of walls, 400 people were still applauding for someone who had already gone. At 3:50 that afternoon, Mara Volkov walked into the hallway of St. Brendan's Church, carrying a stack of cloth napkins, the task Teresa Malloy always gave her before she went into the kitchen, because Teresa said that when someone folded the napkins, the whole kitchen ran more smoothly, and Ruby was pressing her ear against the lamppost. The lamppost was made of cast iron, painted dark green, and had stood in the middle of the hallway since the days when the church still used oil lamps, and now it remained there simply because no one had ever bothered to remove it. Ruby was 9 years old. She was Teresa's granddaughter, and her mother was a nurse who worked the afternoon shift at the hospital on the hill, and every Tuesday and Thursday after school, she came here, not because she had to, but because this was the happiest place she knew, the place where her grandmother was, where there was a table in the corner for doing homework, and where there was a stack of napkins half as tall as she was, that she was allowed to fold and allowed to knock over. She had her cheek pressed against the cold post, her eyes open, her hands gripping both sides. When Mara passed, Ruby looked up and spoke at once, without greeting her, without pausing to gather courage. "It's humming." Mara stopped. "Yes, why?" And Mara Volkov stood there with the stack of napkins in her arms and realized that it was the best question anyone had asked her in 4 years. Not the hardest question, the best one. She sat down on the step and told Ruby about the hollow post, and how every hollow thing had a note of its own, and how that note waited inside it all day until a truck drove past outside or someone closed a door, and then the post sang its note. Ruby listened to all of it, then stood, ran 3 steps to the wooden door leading into the sanctuary, peered inside, and ran back. "Then why does my voice stay longer inside the church?" Mara set the stack of napkins down on the step. "Would you like me to show you?" Ruby nodded so hard that the bow in her hair slipped to one side. The two of them went into the sanctuary and stood in the middle of the aisle between the empty pews, and Mara told her to clap her hands once, as loudly as she could. Ruby clapped. The sound rose toward the vaulted ceiling, remained there, then drifted slowly down, and Mara told her to count, and Ruby counted 1, 2, and before she could say 3, the sound had faded. Then they went back into the hallway. She clapped again. The sound died at once. Ruby clapped once more. It died at once. Ruby cried out with glee, then clapped 3 times in a row, and burst into laughter because she had heard the difference. And she ran into the sanctuary to clap once more and make certain, then ran back into the hallway and clapped again, then ran inside, then ran out. And Mara stood in the doorway watching her do it 4 times without trying to stop her. "The ceiling is higher," Ruby said, breathless. "That's right, and the walls are hard. Out here there's a rug and coats hanging up and all kinds of things, but in there, there's nothing, only wood and stone. You just performed an acoustic measurement." Ruby stopped. "I did what?" "What I spent 4 years at college learning how to do," Mara said. "You did it in 2 minutes. With your own 2 hands." Ruby considered this with the grave expression of someone weighing a business proposal, then said, "That's pretty good," and ran back to the table in the corner to pull out her box of crayons. Mara went into the kitchen. When she came out about 40 minutes later, her hands red and the smell of soap in her hair, Ruby was waiting on the step with a sheet of paper held high in both hands. On the paper was an ear. It filled half the page, purple, drawn in thick, confident strokes of crayon, and circles spread outward from it, one after another, reaching all 4 corners of the paper, each circle a different color. Beneath it, written in uneven capital letters with 1 letter backward, were the words, "Mara can hear everything." "I made it purple because purple is the loudest color," Ruby explained in the voice of an expert presenting her findings. Mara took the paper. She looked at it longer than she had intended. Then she folded it, once in half, then in half again, carefully and precisely along the creases, and slipped it into the inside pocket of the oversized man's coat. "May I keep it?" "You have to keep it," Ruby said. "It belongs to you." Rosalind Rinaldi found her 2 days later on the steps behind the wayside kitchen, close to 9 o'clock at night, just after Mara had finished her shift, and was sitting there with both hands resting open on her knees, letting the wind cool them. Rosalind came alone. There was no car waiting on the street, no one standing 5 paces away, and Mara understood at once that this had been a choice, and that the woman had argued with someone to make it possible. Rosalind was 26. She wore a coat that probably cost as much as an entire year of rent Mara hadn't paid in 4 years, and she stood at the foot of the steps with both hands in her pockets, not knowing how to begin, and strangely enough, that made Mara feel more at ease. "You fixed my brother's room," Rosalind said. "I fixed a floor," Mara said. Rosalind sat down on the step. She sat about an arm's length from Mara, on the dirty concrete, wearing that coat, and she didn't hesitate before doing it, and Mara noticed that and said nothing. For a long while neither of them spoke. Somewhere at the far end of the alley, the lid of a trash bin slammed shut. Then Rosalind spoke, and her voice was so calm that it took Mara a moment to understand what she had just said. "I hate it," Mara turned her head. "That room," Rosalind said. "I hate it. I've never said that to anyone before, and I didn't intend to say it to you. But you're the only person I can tell without having to spend half an hour explaining everything first." She looked down at her hands. 7 years. For 7 years he flew to Europe to speak with people who worked with wood. For 7 years. He came home and spread the plans across the dining table and asked whether I preferred this or that, and I told him I liked either one, and he thought I was being humble. I wasn't being humble. I truly didn't care. She fell silent for a beat. For 7 years he looked at me and saw a broken ear. Not a sister. A broken ear with a sister attached to it. The wind passed through the alley. "I don't want to be fixed," Rosalind said. "I never wanted to be fixed. I only wanted to sit beside him without being a project." Mara remained silent for a very long time. She was silent long enough for Rosalind to begin thinking that perhaps she had said it in the wrong place, to the wrong person, and she was preparing to stand. Then Mara asked, "Have you told him?" "No." Rosalind gave a short laugh with no joy in it. "Do you think I should?" And the answer escaped Mara Volkov's mouth before she could touch it, before she could weigh it, before she could do what she had done with every sentence she had spoken for the past 4 years, which was hold it back and decide how much energy it was worth. "I had my mother for 14 months, she said. The final 14 months. And she never asked me the one question I needed someone to ask. Not once. I sat beside her every night and waited, and she never asked, and now she isn't there to ask anymore. And I'll never know whether she didn't ask because she believed me, or because she was afraid of the answer." She stared straight down the alley. "Tell him." Rosalind Rinaldi turned to look at the woman sitting beside her. She had read everything people had written about Mara Volkov over the past 2 days, every article, every comment, and in all of it there wasn't a single line saying that this woman had ever had a mother. She didn't ask. She sat there a little longer, then stood and brushed off her expensive coat with one careless sweep of her hand, as though it were any ordinary coat, and she said thank you, and she began walking toward the mouth of the alley. Mara let her take 3 steps. Then she asked, in the voice of someone asking something unimportant, something merely incidental, "Which ear do you hear with?" Rosalind turned back. "The right," Mara nodded. She didn't ask anything more. Odette Fairweather recognized her on the 3rd night, and she didn't recognize her by her face. The phone video recorded from the rear rows had already been viewed millions of times, and in it, the woman's face was nothing more than a blur beneath the stage lights. But at the 20-second mark, the woman knelt, then lay face down on the floor, pressed her ear against the wood, and stretched both arms out to her sides, and Odette Fairweather, sitting in the kitchen of her apartment close to midnight, set down her cup. She had seen someone assume that exact position once before in her life, 4 years earlier in another auditorium, in Boston before everything happened, and the truth was cold and brief and anyone could find it in 2 minutes. Harrogate Hall. Opening night, 4 years earlier. The balcony on the 2nd level began vibrating in resonance during the 9th minute of the opening piece. It didn't collapse, it cracked. 40 people were injured. 3 of them would never walk again. The investigation lasted 10 months and concluded that the structure had been approved with an untreated resonance range. The person who signed the final acoustic report was Mara Volkov, an acoustic engineer at Ashgrove Acoustics. Her professional license was revoked. That was the entire record, and it could be read in the time it took to boil a kettle of water. Ashgrove Acoustics issued a statement in less than a day. That statement didn't contain a single lie. It merely said that the company acknowledged the public interest surrounding a recent incident in Providence, that the company wished to restate certain facts already documented in the official record, and then it listed them, cleanly, with page numbers and dates. The final sentence of the statement advised the public to exercise caution when confronted with emotional stories. 6 hours later, the first blow fell. It wasn't a medical record. It wasn't something stolen. It was the transcript of the hearing that revoked her license, a public document that anyone could request with a form and a small fee. And in that transcript, on the page someone had photographed and circled in red, was Mara Volkov's own testimony, spoken in her own voice, under oath, in response to the board's question about her mental condition during the approval period. She had answered, "I hadn't slept in 6 weeks. I wasn't certain I could still trust my own memory." She had said it because she was honest. 4 years later, it became a knife. The second blow fell the following morning, and it was worse. There was a ledger. The handwritten security sign in log from the vessel construction site, a paper record that construction insurance required to be preserved permanently and that no one was permitted to destroy, and inside that ledger, 11 months earlier, was Mara Volkov's name, 3 times, on 3 different nights. Her own signature, clear and undeniable. Within 4 hours, the headline was running across everything with a screen. The woman who, accidentally, knew how to fix the room had been there for an entire year, and she couldn't deny it. She had been there. Odette Fairweather found her on the steps behind the wayside kitchen that afternoon, and asked Mara whether she wanted to make a statement, and she asked with the expression of someone already prepared to be refused. Mara said, "Yes." Odette switched on the recorder, and Mara Volkov didn't deny a single word. "I did say that," she said. "Before the board, under oath. I said it because it was true. That year my mother was dying in the room beside the place where I slept, and I had just lost everything I owned, and I wasn't sleeping, and I didn't trust my memory then. Anyone in my position who still trusted their memory would have worried me." A beat passed. 4 years later, I sat in that room for 5 minutes, and I trusted it. You want to know what changed? It wasn't me. I'm still the same person. Page 14 changed. Odette looked up from the recorder. "Page 14 of the final Harrogate report," Mara said. "The report I signed. The printed copy I signed and the copy they submitted weren't the same on one page. I don't have the original. I never had it. I said this 4 years ago, and no one believed me, because by then I was the woman who had just testified that she couldn't trust her own memory." She looked directly at the recorder. "Find it." And that was the gamble. She spoke the name of a piece of paper she didn't hold in her hands and didn't know still existed, before all of America, and if it wasn't found, then she had just buried herself for the second time, in Providence. Inside a temporary office built behind the auditorium, Pete Langstrom read Ashgrove's entire statement on the screen, then read it again, and then he slammed his hand down on the desk hard enough to make the coffee cup jump. In 22 years of work, no one had ever seen him do that. The next morning, Mara Volkov walked to the impound lot on the south side of the city, and she went not because she had the money, but because she needed to see the car one more time before they sold it. And over the past 4 years, she had learned that seeing something for the last time was better than letting it disappear while she was busy somewhere else. 2 men were standing beside the gate. They weren't Cassius Rinaldi's men. Cassius Rinaldi's men stood differently. They stood as though they were waiting for a ride, while these 2 stood as though they had practiced at home. They didn't touch her. They didn't come closer than 2 steps. The taller one spoke, and he spoke very politely, almost formally, saying that someone wanted her to reconsider attending the upcoming inspection, that this person believed her absence would be better for everyone, and that he was only delivering the message. Mara didn't step back. She didn't step back because she had nowhere to go, and she hadn't had anywhere to go for 4 years, and when a person has stood at the edge of an abyss long enough, eventually they stop being afraid of it. She looked at the 2 men and spoke in the same voice she used when reading a grocery list. You can threaten people who have something to lose. All you can do to me is make me disappear. And if I disappear in this parking lot, then tomorrow all of America will ask why, because this week my name is everywhere, and you know that. That's why you're standing here instead of doing what the man paying you really wants you to do. A beat passed, so please go back and tell him this. He chose the wrong kind of person. The taller man looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, a very small nod, thumb almost courteous, and the 2 men turned, got into their car, and drove away. And Mara stood there and realized that her hands were completely dry. She went to the counter. She was about to tell the woman working there that she only wanted to see the car, that she wasn't taking it out, that she knew she couldn't afford to. The woman typed the license plate number into the computer, looked at the screen, then said the fees had already been paid, her car could be collected at any time, and she only needed to sign there. Mara stood motionless. Who paid? The woman looked at the screen again, scrolled down, then back up. No name. Paid in cash. Mara took the pen. She signed. She knew who it was. She thought she did. The Buick stood in the 4th row, covered with a layer of dust from the lot, a yellow ticket stuck to the windshield. She opened the rear door first. It was still there. Then she sat in the driver's seat and closed the door. And inside that hot, airless, familiar compartment, she reached behind the seat and took down her second coat, the coat she had hung there, the coat that had been hanging there since before the night the car was towed. And she slipped her hand into the inside pocket and pulled out the paper. 4 days. For 4 days, that coat had hung in direct sunlight pouring through the windshield in a parking lot without a single tree for shade. Mara unfolded the paper, and the purple ear was no longer an ear. The wax had melted. It had melted and hardened, then melted again, and all the circles, one after another, the red one, the blue one, the yellow one that a 9-year-old child had drawn over one another, in thick, confident strokes, had all blended together and run downward into a bruised brown stain, and of the uneven capital letters at the bottom, only 3 words could still be read. Mara Volkov, who hadn't cried when she lost her mother, who hadn't cried when they read the decision revoking her license in front of her, who hadn't cried when all of America opened the newspaper and read that she was the woman who couldn't trust her own memory, sat inside the Buick in an impound lot on the south side of Providence and cried over a drawing made by a 9-year-old child, not because it was ruined, because in 4 years it was the only thing anyone had given her. Not food given to keep her alive, not charity, not something left for her out of pity. Given to her, it belongs to you, and she hadn't managed to keep it whole for 4 days. And sitting inside that car with the blurred paper held between both hands, she realized that she had spent 4 years failing to keep anything whole, not one single thing, and she had never once allowed herself to grieve for that, because grief required time, and time was something a person who slept in a car didn't have. That afternoon, she drove the Buick to the vessel, and she thanked Cassius Rinaldi before she had time to think, because that was what she always did. and he looked at her for a moment before saying, "I didn't pay the impound fee." She stood there with the keys in her hand. "I intended to," he said. "My men went there Tuesday afternoon. They came back and told me someone had already paid it that morning, in cash, without leaving a name. I had someone find out who it was." He didn't add that he had found out. He didn't need to. Mara drove back to St. Brendan's Church and parked on the street because the parking lot had just been fenced off that morning. And she entered through the side door. And Father Wendell Price was sitting at the desk in the office behind the sanctuary with a stack of unopened letters in front of him. His left wrist was bare. He had worn that watch throughout the 4 years she had known him. The round-faced watch with the brown leather strap worn almost white near the buckle, his father's watch, and now there was only a strip of skin there, paler than the rest of his arm. She stood in the doorway. "The city didn't tow the car," she said. He didn't look up. "No, the diocese sold the land." "Yes, when?" Only then did he raise his head, and he looked at her, then down at his hands resting on the stack of letters. "The deal was signed 3 months ago, but the turnover date was this week. That's why the city finally cleared the lot 4 days ago." Mara said nothing. "I meant to tell you," he said. "Every week I meant to tell you. I composed the sentence while I shaved. I composed it while I drove to Woonsocket for diocesan meetings. I composed it 3 times while delivering a sermon, my child. I stood at the pulpit speaking about courage, while inside my head I was composing the sentence I would say to you." He stopped. "Then, around the 6th week, I realized something. I wasn't going to tell you. I was only composing it. I was waiting for it to happen on its own, so I wouldn't have to be the one who made it happen." He was still looking down at his hands. "I'm a coward, Mara. I'm 68 years old, and I'm a coward. People keep thinking cowardice has to be large, that it has to make noise. It makes no noise at all. It's only a man sitting in a room and keeping his mouth closed, week after week, telling himself that he'll speak next week." She didn't enter. She remained in the doorway. "I let you sleep in that car for 4 years, he said. "For 4 years, I didn't ask what you intended to do with your life. For 4 years, I didn't push you anywhere. I let you stay because when you were there, I could sleep." Now he lifted his head, and he looked directly at her. "Do you think I kept the hallway light on for you? For 4 years, every night before I went to bed, I walked to the window of my room and looked down at the parking lot. If there was a small light inside your car, that reading lamp you used to turn on, then I knew you were still there, and I could go to sleep. If there wasn't, I stood there until I saw it. I kept the hallway light on so that if you needed to come inside, you could. Yes, but I kept it on mostly because I couldn't bear the thought of looking down at that lot and seeing darkness." He breathed out. "You were the reason I looked out the window every night, Mara. For 4 years, I was selfish. And I wasn't brave enough to stop being selfish. I was only brave enough to wait for someone else to do it for me." Mara wasn't angry. She stood there and looked at him, and there wasn't a grain of anger inside her. And that was exactly where it hurt, because if she had been angry, he would have had something to endure, and she didn't give him that. She looked at his bare wrist. "You sold the watch, yes. Why?" Father Wendell Price looked at the pale strip of skin around his wrist for a long time. "Because it was the only thing I could do," he said, "after I failed to do the other thing. Cassius Rinaldi didn't threaten Desmond Whitaker. He didn't need to. Among the 3 transportation companies Cassius operated was an equipment leasing company, and in that company's debt portfolio were 3 loans in the personal name of Desmond Whitaker, the chief financial officer of Ashgrove Acoustics, signed back in the years when he still believed he would always be able to repay them. Cassius called all 3 loans at once. He gave Whitaker 2 days. That was all he did, and it was legal from beginning to end, and it destroyed the life Desmond Whitaker had spent 30 years building faster than anything that made noise ever could. Whitaker lost his house. He lost his seat on the board. His wife moved out that weekend. And during those 2 days, in order to save the only thing that could still be saved, he opened a door to Cassius's people that he had kept locked for 4 years. Access to Ashgrove's project records archive. Not emails. Not internal notes. Only project records the material construction law required them to preserve and prohibited them from destroying. And there, lying untouched inside a backup folder no one had opened since the spring 4 years earlier, was the original Harrogate acoustic report. All 31 pages. Complete with a digital signature. Complete with a timestamp. Complete with a scan of the printed copy bearing the handwritten signature. And there was one detail in the whole story that, later, whenever Pete Langstrom told it to someone else, still made him pause for a beat before saying it aloud. The order to delete that entire backup folder had been sent 4 hours after Mara Volkov spoke the words page 14 into a recorder, and all of America heard them. The order was never carried out. The person responsible for the server was a contract technician in Cranston, who had quit 3 weeks earlier. And during those 3 weeks, no one had remembered to revoke his access, just as no one had remembered to assign his duties to someone else. For 4 years, no one deleted it because no one believed anyone would ever come looking. Within 4 hours, someone wanted it erased, and there was no longer anyone there to do it. They gave her a printed copy. She read it at the table inside the temporary office behind the vessel's auditorium, standing, not sitting, with Cassius on the other side of the table, and Pete Langstrom standing in the doorway, and no one spoke a word. Page 14, her signature in the lower right corner, the signature she had written thousands of times in her life and no longer recognized as her own. The table of figures in the upper half, the conclusion in the lower half, and the third line from the bottom, the line that, in the version submitted to the board, contained a harmless sentence recommending additional monitoring during operation, was something entirely different here. She read it. I can't approve this structure. The resonance range will be activated by human load. This isn't a theoretical risk. She read it again. She read it a third time. She didn't cry. She stood there with both hands resting on the edge of the table and read that line 3 times, and Cassius Rinaldi watched her face and saw nothing. No anger, no relief, no triumph. He saw only someone checking a calculation. Then she spoke very softly, and she wasn't speaking to anyone in the room. I remembered correctly. That was all. That was everything she needed. Not justice, because justice was something other people gave you, and she had stopped expecting anything to be given. Not her license, because that piece of paper would either return or it wouldn't, and she had lived 4 years without it. What she needed was something much smaller and much heavier. The knowledge that throughout those 4 years, when she lay inside a car in the middle of a Rhode Island winter, and replayed that night in her mind for the 100th time, for the 1,000th time, and every time saw herself sitting at the table with the pen in her hand, believing she had written that sentence, she hadn't been lying to herself. All of America had read her testimony and concluded that she was a woman who couldn't trust her own memory, and now, standing inside that temporary office with the paper in her hands, she knew. Her memory had never lied to her. People had only lied about it. She set the paper down on the table and asked him the question she had been holding in her mouth since the moment she walked in. What did you do to him? I collected a debt, Cassius said. I held 3 of his loans. I called all 3. Nothing I did fell outside the contracts he signed. His son is 12 years old. Cassius Rinaldi looked at her for a very long time. He didn't blink. He didn't change his posture. Then he spoke, his voice dropping to a low, chilling murmur. Your mother was 51. The entire room went still. Pete Langstrom, standing in the doorway, lowered his eyes to the floor. And they were both right, and that was precisely why there was no way out, because if either of them had been wrong, there would have been an answer, and neither of them was wrong. Mara said nothing. Cassius pushed another sheet of paper across the table. There is one more thing you need to know before you decide to hate me for what happened to Whitaker, he said. Whitaker wasn't the one who decided to replace the page. He signed it. He signed what someone else put in front of him. He was the chief financial officer. He didn't read acoustic reports. He didn't understand a single line of that one. He was simply the person with the cheapest signature in the room that day. Mara looked at the paper. It was an organizational chart. There was one name at the top. Corinne Ashgrove Vance, Cassius said. She called Whitaker into her office. She spoke with him for about 20 minutes. He walked out and signed. That was everything that happened. Can you prove it? No. He said it without the slightest trace of bitterness. I have every record she produced over 4 years. Every email, every calendar entry, every internal message. She never wrote a single word about it. Not one word. She knows how to talk. Do you understand? That is the only truly dangerous skill in this world. Not money. Not guns. Knowing how to make something happen without ever leaving behind a single line proving that you wanted it to happen. Have you caught her yet? No. Why not? Cassius looked toward the window. Because she didn't break the law. She only talked. I can't catch someone who knows how to talk. A beat passed. I only know how to talk to them. Mara looked at him. You just described yourself, I know, he said. That is why I stopped pursuing her. If I make her disappear, then I prove that she was right about me, and about this world, and about the belief that in the end, everything is only the stronger person speaking to the weaker one. I would rather let her win. And Mara Volkov said the sentence that made him stand perfectly still. You just gave me the thing I wanted most in my life, she said. That paper. For 4 years I had nothing except my memory, and now I have the paper. And I can't thank you. I don't need you to thank me, I know. That is the problem. She looked at him. You don't need anything, Mr. Rinaldi. You don't need gratitude. You don't need to be understood. And you don't need anyone's permission. A person who needs nothing doesn't know where to stop. My father told me that when I was 7 years old. He was talking about a machine, but I think he was talking about people. Then she sat down. It was the first time she had sat in that room, and she spoke the truth she hadn't told anyone in 4 years. The Harrogate record says 40 people were injured, she said. There were 41. The 41st person wasn't listed because she walked out of the building on her own feet and told everyone she was fine. She wouldn't let anyone examine her because she didn't have insurance and she didn't want her daughter to pay for it. She died 14 months later. Cassius said nothing. Her name was Halina Volkov, Mara said. She played the organ at a Ukrainian church in Fall River. She came to the concert that night because her daughter had designed that room. She wore a dress she had been saving since before I learned to read. She sat in the 9th row. Mara looked down at her hands. I was sitting 4 seats away from her. I heard the resonance begin in the second. That frequency. The frequency I had written into 3 reports that no one read. I had 3 seconds. I stood up. A beat passed. I didn't have time to call her name. No one knew when Pete Langstrom had left the doorway, and only 2 people remained in that temporary room, and Cassius Rinaldi stood on the other side of the table for a long while before pulling out the chair and sitting down. He had never sat in that room before. You asked why it was 3.5 million, he said. Mara hadn't asked, but she had asked in another way, outside the Eastern Service door, when she said she assumed it was real, and he had heard the true question beneath those words, just as he had heard the word still. When I was 19, my sister was 11, he said. There was an operation in Philadelphia. They told us that if it was done before puberty, the chances were much better, and if we waited too long, there would be no point. The cost of the operation, everything included, travel, post-operative care, was 3.5 million. He placed both hands on the table. My father said no. Mara said nothing. I need you to understand this correctly, Cassius said. He didn't say no because he didn't have the money. He did. He said no because he believed children had to learn to live with what they had. He told me he had lived with less than that, and that what the little girl needed wasn't a new ear, but to learn how to make her way through life with the ear she already had. And he said it without anger, without cruelty. He said it the way a man might teach me how to tie my shoes. He believed it. That was the worst part. He truly believed it. He looked toward the window. I made 3.5 million in 11 months. A beat passed. My father had 3 warehouses at the harbor. He knew what the first one held and what the second one held. He didn't know what the third one held. I did. I was 19, I had a key, I had ears, and I knew. And I sold what I knew to people who were never supposed to know. His voice didn't change. 3 people died because of what I sold. I didn't kill them. I only told the people who would kill them where they were. The only sound in the room was the ventilation fan in the ceiling. The operation failed, Cassius said. It didn't go wrong. It failed. They told us that sometimes the body doesn't accept it. And they said those words in a hospital hallway at 4 o'clock in the morning. And they said them very kindly. And they had said them many times before to many other people. My sister woke up and could still hear with only one ear. She still hears with one ear today. He touched the thin scar running from his left eyebrow up across his forehead. A touch so quick it was almost not a gesture at all. This came from that night. No one did it to me. There was a glass door in the waiting room. He straightened in his chair. You said that a person who needs nothing doesn't know where to stop. You were right, but you didn't finish the thought. I can't stop because I paid 3.5 million with 3 human lives. And it bought nothing. Not one thing. If I sit still for one evening with nothing to do, then I have to sit down and add up that calculation. And I haven't added it up in 15 years. The room out there was how I avoided adding it up for another 7, and Mara Volkov sat there and looked at him. For 4 years she had carried a guilt that wasn't hers, carried it every day, carried it into the car every night, and now she was looking at a man carrying a debt that wasn't his, an ear that wasn't his, a failure he hadn't caused, and had entered into his own ledger when he was 19 years old. The two people sitting on opposite sides of that table suffered from the same illness, and they had paid for it for 15 years and 4 years, and neither of them knew how to put it down. Mara didn't tell him she forgave him. She had no right to do that, and she knew she didn't. She only said, "On the final night, my mother held my hand." She hadn't been able to speak for several days. She spoke in Ukrainian, because in the end people returned to their first language. She asked me, "You heard it, didn't you?" I said yes. She said, "Then you did your part. The rest isn't for your ears to carry." Mara looked down at the table. Then she fell asleep. She never woke again. A beat passed. For 4 years I didn't believe her. The inspection hearing convened on a Thursday morning inside the auditorium itself, because the board wanted to hear the room rather than read about it, and the vessel's temporary occupancy permit had less than 1 week remaining. By the 3rd minute, the issue was already on the table, and there was no avoiding it. None of the modifications made to the room bore the signature of a licensed engineer, because the person who designed them didn't have a license. Then Ashgrove's attorney rose, produced the security log, and asked the question the entire country had been asking for 2 weeks. "You came to this construction site 3 times, 11 months ago. Why?" Mara Volkov remained silent for a very long time, long enough for someone on the board to clear their throat. Then she said, "To remember who I used to be." No one spoke. "I'm an acoustic engineer," she said. "I've been an acoustic engineer since I was 7 years old, before I knew the words existed. Then they took away the paper, and when they took away the paper, I was no longer allowed inside any building. Not one construction site, not one auditorium under construction. 4 years. And in Fox Point. They were building the largest acoustic project New England had ever seen, 8 kilometers from where I slept." She looked at the logbook on the table. "I walked there on 3 nights. I stood near the entrance. I asked the night guard whether I was allowed to wait there to listen, and he was kind enough to let me sit inside his security cabin to get out of the cold. Since I was past the perimeter gate, he told me to sign the visitor log, and I signed it. I used my real name, 3 times. From inside the cabin, I heard the drills echoing from inside the chamber between 2 layers of wall, and from the way the sound came back, I knew how many layers the wall had and what was between them." The attorney said, "Then you had an advantage." "Yes," Mara said. "My advantage was spending 4 years forbidden from going inside." Behind the board, inside the temporary office, Pete Langstrom stood with Cassius Rinaldi and a sheet of paper in front of him. He hadn't signed it. "I need to tell you something before I sign this," he said. "Tell me." On the 3rd day. After we brought in 400 people and the room performed cleanly, I went home. I slept for about 2 hours. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I sat upright in bed and thought. They sat still. He spoke the sentence aloud, then stood motionless. "I had that exact thought, Mr. Rinaldi. Whole and complete." At 3 o'clock on the morning of the 4th day, a beat passed. I wrote it in my notebook. Then I crossed it out. Cassius said nothing. "Why?" "Because it didn't sound like an engineer's thought," Pete said. "It sounded like a poet's thought. It had no number. It couldn't be tested." I sat on my bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, heard that thought inside my own head, and felt ashamed of it. He placed the leather notebook on the table and opened it. The page was still there. The sentence was still there, and so was the mark across it, 2 firm diagonal strokes. 22 years taught me to cross it out. I didn't fail to think of it. I thought of it, and then I killed it myself, quickly and cleanly, and went back to sleep. Cassius studied the page for a long time. "Are you going to tell her?" "No, why?" "Because she'll say it's all right," Pete said. "And I need it not to be all right." Then he took the pen and signed. 22 years, his license, his name, placed beneath a modification designed by a woman who slept inside a car in a church parking lot. "I placed 22 years behind a room, and I was wrong," he said. "Now I'm placing them behind a person, and I'm right. You know, this is the first time in 22 years that I've signed something I understand completely." Inside the auditorium, as the board prepared to vote, Hollis Treadway rose. He stated his name. He said he was the 3rd member of the board. Then he said that he had a conflict of interest, that he had been inside this building throughout those 5 days, that he had failed along with 18 other people, and that he was withdrawing from the board and wouldn't vote. The chair accepted his withdrawal. He remained standing. "I would like permission to say one thing in a personal capacity," he said. "I'm not voting. I no longer have any interest here. That is why I withdrew before speaking, so no one would believe I was trying to purchase something." He looked directly at the board. "I'm standing here to place into the permanent record of this building that on the 4th day I looked Ms. Volkov directly in the face outside the door and told her that I didn't have time for a mad woman. I said it in front of her. I didn't lower my voice." He breathed out. "I was wrong, and I was wrong in a specific way that troubles me more than simply being wrong in general. I was wrong because I believed a degree was the same thing as ability. 34 years told me that a degree was ability. 34 years were wrong. I want that placed in the record, so that 50 years from now, someone may read it and know that this room nearly ceased to exist, because one man refused to listen for 5 seconds. He sat down. The vessel received its permit that morning. 7 months later, Mara Volkov sat in an examination room in Kingston with 200 other people, most of them 6 or 7 years younger than she was, and took the professional licensing examination from 8 o'clock in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. Cassius Rinaldi had tried to buy it. He told her that plainly, without circling around it, that he had instructed his lawyers to search for every possible opening in the law, and there wasn't one, that once a revoked license had remained expired, beyond the permitted period, the holder had to take the examination again, with no exceptions and no one to speak to. He said he was sorry. Mara said, "Good. If you could buy it, then it would belong to you." "I want it to belong to me," she passed. The only question she answered incorrectly concerned an administrative regulation that had changed during the 4 years she was washing dishes at the wayside kitchen. The vessel's second opening night took place on an October evening, and Eloise Hartwell Briggs found her in the hallway before the performance. She was in a wheelchair. She had once taught piano. She was one of the 3 people who had never walked again after Harrogate. "You're the one who sent the money," she said. Mara didn't answer. "For 4 years I thanked the wrong people. I wrote letters to the insurance company. I wrote letters to Ashgrove. I wrote letters to a foundation I thought was real." She looked at Mara. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't an apology," Mara said. "I had no right to apologize to you." "No," Eloise said. "You didn't. You had another right. The right to hear me say thank you. You took 4 years away from me. 4 years in which I could have said that word to the right person. Sit down." And Mara sat down. The music that evening lasted far longer than 8 minutes, and 8 minutes was all Eloise Hartwell Briggs's back had allowed her to remain seated since that night in Boston. She stayed for the entire performance. When the lights came up, she turned to Mara and said, "Do you know why? Because the seats in this hall were designed by someone building it for a person who hears with one ear. That person thought about the body. For 4 years, no one thought about my body. They thought about my file. Tonight, someone thought about my body." Later, in the side aisle, Mara stood beside Cassius and said, "Your sister touches her ear before the note reaches her, half a second before. She did it again today. She gets nervous, no." Mara looked toward the front row. "She reads the room. She knows the sound is going to remain before it remains, because she feels the air inside the room change before it makes a sound. 20 years of hearing with one ear taught her to hear through her skin. A beat passed. You spent 7 years building a room to repair her ear. She had already repaired herself when she was 6 years old. You simply never asked." Rosalind rose from the front row and came toward them, and she had heard everything, and she told her brother the sentence she had kept inside herself for 15 years. "I didn't tell you, because you would have treated it as something I had to compensate for. It isn't compensation. It is something I have that you don't." A beat passed. "My ear isn't your hand." Eloise looked at the gray sweater Mara was wearing and asked where she had bought it, and Mara said she had bought it with her own money, for the first time in 4 years. Eloise asked, "You didn't wear the dress? People say you keep a dress in your car." Mara looked at her. "The dress wasn't mine." Eloise waited. "My mother borrowed it from a neighbor in Fall River to attend a wedding. The neighbor moved away before my mother could return it. She kept it for 30 years, and every year she said that the next year she would find the woman." A beat passed. "For 4 years I kept it because I thought it belonged to my mother. It didn't. It was a debt my mother never managed to repay. and I kept it exactly the way she kept it, for 4 years. Telling myself next year, did you find the woman? Yes, it took 5 months. She had changed her last name twice. I hired someone to find her. That was the first thing I bought with Mr. Rinaldi's money. A beat passed. I couldn't find her for 4 years, not because I didn't want to, but because finding people costs money, and I didn't have money. Poverty isn't simply having no money. Poverty is being charged more for the same thing. Did you return it? Yes. She is 81 years old and lives in Woonskocht. She didn't remember the dress. A beat passed. She remembered my mother. Then what are you carrying now? Nothing, Mara said. Then she corrected herself, because that was what she had learned to do. No, I'm wearing a sweater. I bought it. Ruby came running toward them with a sheet of paper raised high in both hands. On it was a purple ear, and this time, inside the ear was a room filled with people sitting down. I drew this one with colored pencils, she announced proudly. Grandma said crayons melt. Your grandmother was right. My grandmother is always right, Ruby said. But I thought of it first. The 9th row was founded that winter, named by Rosalind, as a board that inspected public buildings in a way no one else did, by testing them with people inside. Its only principle, written by Mara on a single sheet of paper, was this: measure what it does, not what it is. Pete Langstrom served as an advisor, and what he taught wasn't how to find the answer, but how to recognize the rut in which you were standing, because he knew that rut from the inside, and he needed the young people to know it existed before they fell into it. Applications arrived from everywhere, from people who had never held any degree at all. The first person selected was an elderly woman who had tuned pianos for 41 years. That night Mara Volkov sat in the 9th row. The conductor raised his hand. The first note sounded, and it remained. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 4 years, she heard music instead of a warning. Ability doesn't introduce itself. It doesn't arrive carrying documents or a distinguished family name. Sometimes it arrives in an oversized coat, sleeps in an old car in a church parking lot, and carries nothing except the ability to hear the question everyone else has forgotten to ask. And the frightening thing isn't that this happened once. The frightening thing is that somewhere, at this very moment, someone is sitting in the darkness and knows exactly what is wrong, and no one is asking them. We don't lack people who can hear. We lack people willing to listen to them. This story leaves us with a few very simple truths. First, a degree proves that someone has studied. It doesn't prove that someone has understood, and when we confuse those two things, we lose the most valuable people we may ever have the chance to meet. Second, respect shouldn't depend on the clothes someone is wearing, or where they slept the night before, because dignity isn't something people earn. It is something they are born possessing. Third, truly helping someone doesn't mean granting them a favor. It means asking them a question and taking the time to hear their answer all the way through. And finally, poverty doesn't make anyone smaller. Only our indifference makes them appear smaller in our eyes. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that every day you can have more meaningful stories to listen to. How did Mara's story make you feel? Have you ever been the person others underestimated? Or have you ever been the one who refused to listen to someone? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.